Story 1. I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus on the endless pile of work before me, when something caught my eye. A small package sat on my doorstep, inconspicuous yet strangely unsettling. It wasn't large, and the brown wrapping paper was crinkled as if it had been tossed around or mishandled, its edges fraying. There was no return address, no name, nothing to indicate where it had come from. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it. After all, packages without senders are usually mistakes or some marketing gimmick. But something in the pit of my stomach told me this one was different. Against my better judgment, curiosity took over. I picked it up, and the moment the package touched my hands, I felt an odd weight, as though something far heavier than just paper and tape was hidden inside. My mind raced with possibilities, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling in the air. Carefully, I brought it inside, my heartbeat quickening as I removed the tape with trembling fingers. Inside, there was nothing but an old photograph of me as a child. I froze. The image stared back at me, a photo from a family gathering, one I hadn't seen in years. There I was, smiling, holding a toy car with my parents in the background. The moment flooded back in an instant, one of those memories that's tucked away, only to resurface unexpectedly. Seeing it again filled me with an odd mixture of warmth and dread, the kind of feeling that creeps up your spine when something's not quite right. Who had sent this? And why? I flipped the photo over, hoping for a clue, a note, anything that could explain its sudden appearance. But there was nothing. The back was as blank as the front, save for the edges, which had yellowed with age, a sign of time passing in silence. I stared at it, my mind running through possibilities. Was it from someone I knew? Someone from my past? But nothing came to me. It was like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The longer I stared, the more unsettled I became. The photo felt like it was watching me. I took it to the kitchen, setting it on the counter as I rifled through drawers, desperate to find something, anything, that could help explain this strange intrusion. I tried to shake off the creeping unease, telling myself it was just an old photograph, a relic of the past that had somehow made its way into my hands. But the lack of a sender, the odd specificity of it, gnawed at me. It was too strange, too personal. It was almost as if someone had been waiting for me to react. Hours passed, but I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. Every time I looked at it, I felt like I was missing something, like there was a detail just out of reach that could explain everything. But the photo remained unchanged, its eerie stillness mocking me. The question echoed relentlessly in my mind: who would send this to me? And why? I decided to call my parents, hoping they might have some insight. When my mom answered, I hesitated before speaking, my voice unsteady. "Mom, did you send me a package?" Her voice was filled with confusion. "What do you mean?" I told her about the strange package and the photograph. She was just as puzzled as I was. "That's strange. I don't know who would do that." "But honey, are you sure it's a picture of you?" I held the photo up again, running my fingers over it. The weight of it, the unsettling sense that something was terribly wrong, was palpable. "It's definitely me," I said, my voice tight. "But I don't know who could have sent it." Mom sighed on the other end of the line. "Well, keep an eye out, okay? Maybe it's just someone trying to get a reaction out of you. Just be careful." Her words should have comforted me, but they didn't. The knot in my stomach only tightened. The longer I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't a harmless prank. This was something else. Something I couldn't quite understand. I decided to keep the photograph, hoping it might somehow be important later. But as the hours wore on, something even stranger started to happen. Every time I looked at the photograph, the expression on my face seemed to change. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in my smile, but the longer I stared at it, the more it felt like my younger self was watching me, aware of me in the present. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger. The sensation was almost suffocating, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My chest tightened, and an icy chill washed over me. I took the photograph with me when I went to bed, hoping it would give me some semblance of control. I couldn't explain why I felt compelled to do so, but it was as if the photo had become a part of me. Yet, as I lay there in the dark, the silence around me felt oppressive, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint rustling noise coming from the living room. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The house was otherwise silent. My mind spun through 1,000 possibilities, from a break-in to some bizarre prank. I clutched the photograph to my chest and cautiously got out of bed, my every step slow and deliberate. As I reached the living room, everything appeared normal. The lights were off, the windows closed. But when I reached the table where I had left the photo earlier, I stopped dead in my tracks. The photograph had moved. It was now facing a different direction, angled slightly to the side, as if it had been carefully shifted. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. I picked it up, the weight of it feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. The photograph had moved on its own. The blood drained from my face as I backed away, the room suddenly feeling too small, too confined. Desperately, I turned the photo over again, hoping for some kind of explanation, some sign that this wasn't just a cruel joke. But there was only one word written on the back, scrawled in faded ink, barely legible. Run. A wave of terror washed over me. I had no idea who was behind this, or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure, whoever it was, they weren't finished with me yet. Story 2. It was a quiet evening. I had just finished my dinner, the warmth of the meal still lingering in my chest as I sank into the comfort of my living room. The house was still, the kind of silence that made everything feel distant, as if time itself had slowed. I scrolled mindlessly through my phone, lost in the endless distractions of social media and trivial updates, my mind unwinding after a long day. Then, in the corner of my eye, the lights flickered. Just for a split second, a brief moment where everything seemed to pause, as if the house was holding its breath. I looked up, instinctively, but I didn't think much of it. Power outages weren't all that rare where I lived. It wasn't a big deal. I waited for the light to return, expecting everything to settle back into place. But when the lights came back on, I froze. At first, I thought my eyes were deceiving me. I blinked, rubbed them, tried to steady myself. But no, the room was different, wrong. My couch, which had always faced the TV, was now positioned at an odd angle, turned toward the window. The coffee table, usually in its familiar spot, had been moved, now positioned diagonally across the room. And my chair, the chair I always left near the bookshelf, was now smack in the middle of the floor, isolated and strange. Everything was out of place. My heart raced in my chest as I stood up, the weight of confusion and dread settling over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't possible. I hadn't touched anything. I walked slowly, carefully, through the room, running my fingers over the furniture, half expecting it to return to its original place with the smallest touch. But nothing happened. Everything stayed the same. The pieces of the puzzle had shifted, and no matter how much I tried to make sense of it, they refused to fit. I checked every other room in the house, praying I was just mistaken, hoping that maybe, somehow, I had moved everything and forgotten. But no. Every single room, every inch of the house, was as strange as the last. Every corner felt wrong, unnerving, as though the house itself had changed overnight. I walked to the door, checked the locks. Everything was secure. No windows had been opened. No sign of anyone breaking in. The house was safe. But it wasn't right. There was something else, something unseen, that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was like an oppressive force had moved in, rearranged everything in a way that felt personal, deliberate. I pulled out my phone, desperate for some kind of connection, some sign that the world outside was still functioning. I dialed a friend, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was weak, almost non-existent. I wandered through the house in a daze, my thoughts a whirlwind. Why would someone rearrange my furniture like this? What did they want? It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a prank. This felt like a message, a statement. And it wasn't one I could understand. The silence in the house was suffocating. Every little creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sounded like thunder. It was as though the house was alive, watching me, breathing in the same air. I finally sat down on the couch, now positioned awkwardly in the corner of the room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of movement, shadows darting in my peripheral vision, things that weren't there when I looked directly at them. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Whoever had been here, moving the furniture, watching me, hadn't been trying to hide. They wanted me to see it, to know they were in control. And they were watching me still. Hours passed, and the house grew colder, the temperature dropping as though the walls themselves had absorbed the chill. I heard faint sounds, something shifting in the dark, a movement I couldn't quite place, but when I checked, everything was still. Everything was wrong. I couldn't stay awake much longer. I needed to keep watch, to protect myself from whatever this was. I grabbed a blanket and huddled in the armchair, my eyes darting between the dark corners of the room, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. Then, at midnight, the lights flickered again. This time, the flickering didn't stop. The lights dimmed and brightened, as if struggling to stay alive, flickering in an erratic, disturbing pattern. My pulse quickened. I gripped the arm of the chair, watching the overhead light with a sense of dread clawing at me. Then, with a deafening pop, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into suffocating darkness. I sat there, heart hammering in my chest, my ears ringing with the silence. The air felt thick, electric, as though something unseen was pressing in on me, suffocating me. I stood, but my legs were weak, trembling. I reached for my phone, hoping the flashlight would offer me some comfort, but the screen remained black. The battery had died. I could see my breath now, thin plumes of it rising in the freezing air. Every inhale felt like a struggle. I needed to get out of the house, but where could I go? What was waiting for me outside? Something was here. I could feel it, a presence that wasn't mine, something other lurking just beyond my reach. I stumbled toward the door, brushing against the strange furniture as I moved through the dark. My hand touched the handle, and I pulled. The door opened with a groan, the cold night air slapping my face as I stepped onto the porch. But then I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps behind me, following me, just out of sight. My heart froze in my chest. I turned quickly, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing. Just the empty room, the furniture still rearranged, mocking me. I turned back to the door, my breath shallow, and bolted. I ran through the yard, not stopping until I hit the street. My feet pounded the pavement, my chest heaving, but the feeling of being watched, the sense that something was still behind me, never left. I never went back to that house. I couldn't. Whoever had been there, whoever had rearranged my life so deliberately, had been watching me. And I knew, deep down, that they would always find a way to come back. Story 3. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. The sky bled into a deep amber as I wiped down the kitchen counters, the smell of dinner still lingering in the air. It had been a quiet evening, too quiet. I was just about to finish when a knock at the door interrupted the stillness. At first, I thought it was just a delivery, or maybe a neighbor with some trivial excuse to stop by, but when I opened the door, I was met with something much more unsettling. A woman stood before me, disheveled and wild-eyed. Her hair was a tangled mess, her coat worn thin from years of neglect. She looked at me with an intensity in her gaze that sent an immediate shiver down my spine. Before I could even form a response, she asked, "Do you remember me?" Her voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was a desperate urgency in it that made my heart skip a beat. I stared at her, trying to place her face. She seemed vaguely familiar, like a distant figure from a forgotten dream, but the details wouldn't come. My mind raced, grasping at straws, but there was nothing. No name, no memory, nothing. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I do. Have we met before?" Her expression faltered, as though she had just lost something precious, and then she took a step closer to the door, her eyes never leaving mine. There was something almost frantic about her now. "You must," she insisted, her voice trembling. "We've known each other. Long ago. Please, think hard." A cold chill crawled up my spine. There was something terribly wrong here, something that felt off, like a ghost lingering just out of sight. Despite her insistence, I was certain I had never seen her before in my life. "I really don't know who you are," I said again, my voice firm but laced with unease. "I'm sorry." She didn't respond at first, but I could see it in her eyes, something dark, something knowing. And then, as if her words were catching in her throat, she opened her mouth again, but stopped, the silence hanging heavy between us. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in on me from all sides. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice suddenly soft, almost pleading. The shift was so subtle, but it sent another wave of unease washing over me. I froze, my instincts screaming at me to shut the door, to end this strange encounter. But her presence, there was something magnetic, something that kept me rooted to the spot. I took a step back, my hand hovering over the door, uncertain of how to respond. "I don't think that's a good idea," I finally managed, my voice faltering. "I don't know you, and I'm not comfortable with this." For a moment, she stood there, unmoving, her gaze unblinking. Her stare seemed to pierce through me, searching for something that wasn't there. Then, just as I thought I might be able to escape, she spoke again, her voice now a hushed whisper, "You don't remember, do you? What happened that night?" The words hit me like a slap. My breath caught in my throat, but I couldn't grasp their meaning. That night? What was she talking about? My pulse quickened, the air growing suffocatingly thick with tension. I couldn't place her, couldn't make sense of any of this. My grip on the door tightened, the wood pressing against my palms as I tried to steady myself. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice nearly breaking with the fear creeping up my spine. "Please, just leave." For a moment, she didn't speak. She just stared at me, her eyes searching my face as though looking for something she thought she would find. Then, without a word, she stepped back. I watched her, confused and relieved, as she turned to leave. But then she paused and glanced over her shoulder. "You'll remember," she said, her voice calm yet laden with certainty. "You'll remember soon enough." And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. She disappeared into the deepening shadows of the evening, her figure swallowed by the growing darkness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty space where she had stood, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. With shaking hands, I closed and locked the door, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. What had just happened? Who was she? And what did she mean by that night? The questions rattled around in my mind like a chorus of whispers, but none of it made sense. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Her eyes, her voice, the strange sense of familiarity that had gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was missing, that a part of me, some memory, had been torn away and locked out of reach. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just the stress, or my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't escape the sensation that something was terribly wrong. The days passed uneventfully, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I passed a mirror, I felt as though I wasn't looking at myself. It was like I was seeing a stranger staring back, and I couldn't quite place who I was looking at. I tried to push it aside, but it kept crawling back into my thoughts. Then one morning, a letter arrived. The envelope was addressed to me, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single line, written in stark black ink, "You remember now, don't you?" The moment I read those words, it felt like a jolt of electricity shot through me. Everything, every detail, every forgotten memory, came rushing back, sharp, painful, unstoppable. I remembered that night. The night she had disappeared. The woman at my door wasn't just some stranger. She was someone I had known. Someone I had lost. I stood there, the letter trembling in my hands, as the flood of memories overwhelmed me. I had blocked them out, buried them so deep, but now they were clawing their way back to the surface. And as I stood there, shaking, I realized that the encounter with her, the woman, the memories, everything, was just the beginning. What was coming next was far darker than I could have ever imagined. Story 4. I was sitting at my desk, mindlessly sorting through a stack of old papers, when something caught my eye, a scrap of paper wedged between two folders. At first glance, it seemed like nothing, just another forgotten note. But as I picked it up, a chill ran through me. The handwriting was unmistakable, it was mine. My name was written across the top in that same familiar loop, the rhythm of my penmanship that I recognized as well as my own heartbeat. But what followed, was not something I could ever remember writing. The words stared back at me, "You won't believe what I've seen." A shiver crawled up my spine. I stared at those words, my mind unable to make sense of them. The paper felt strangely warm in my hands, as though it had been sitting there, waiting, for far longer than it should have. My pulse quickened, and I turned the paper over, half expecting to find something else, a reason, an explanation. But the other side was blank, nothing but the stark emptiness of paper, untouched, as if it had never been written on at all. A wave of dread washed over me, cold and thick. How could I have written this? Why would I write something so cryptic and unsettling? I tried to reason with myself, to dismiss the panic rising in my chest. Maybe it was a note I'd scribbled down during a late-night rush of thoughts, something I'd forgotten in the haze of stress. But the longer I looked at it, the more something didn't sit right. I felt, watched. The room around me seemed to pulse, the silence now oppressive, as though it was holding its breath. The words on the paper seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't explain. What had I seen? The question echoed in my mind, a riddle I couldn't solve. I was sure I'd been home all day, nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Yet, the more I thought about it, the more the sensation of something missing grew stronger. It was like the edges of a memory were just out of reach, teasing me with the faintest whispers of something I should know. My thoughts spiraled. Could I have written this in my sleep? Was I sleepwalking, leaving messages for myself in some half-conscious state? The idea was absurd, laughable even. But a small voice inside me, a voice I couldn't quite shake, wondered if that's exactly what had happened. Desperately, I pulled out my journals, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the strange note. But there was nothing. Just the same mundane daily entries about errands, appointments, meals, and thoughts, nothing out of the ordinary. No hints, no clues. The note taunted me, the words "you won't believe what I've seen" repeating in my mind like a broken record. I felt like I was on the edge of discovering something important. But no matter how hard I searched, it felt like I was being pulled further away from the truth. I set the note down on my desk, the tension in my chest tightening, my mind racing. The longer I looked at it, the more it seemed wrong. It wasn't just a message, it felt like a warning. A warning of something I wasn't meant to know yet. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching into eternity. The tension built inside me, suffocating, until I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to leave. I had to escape the pressure of my own thoughts, the suffocating weight of the room that felt like it was closing in on me. I grabbed my jacket, ready to flee the house and clear my head, but just as my hand touched the doorknob, something made me freeze. My heart stopped. The note was gone. I whipped around, breath catching in my throat, scanning the room in a frenzy. No sign of it. The desk, the floor, the shelves, everything in its place. I rushed to the desk, my hands shaking as I rifled through the papers, the folders, the clutter. But it was useless. The note had vanished. My pulse raced, my mind spinning with confusion. How could it just disappear? Had I imagined it? Had I made the whole thing up? A surge of panic swept over me, my hands trembling as I collapsed back into the chair. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like the world was slipping through my fingers. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The paper. It was back. I stared at it, unable to breathe, as the words stared back at me, just as they had before. You won't believe what I've seen. This time, the words seemed heavier. They pulsed with an energy that seemed to seep into my bones. My fingers brushed the edges of the paper, and I could almost feel the message vibrating with some unseen force. I knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary note. It wasn't just a memory I had forgotten, it was a message, meant for me. But I wasn't ready to understand it. Not yet. The room grew colder. The shadows lengthened, stretching unnaturally across the floor, as though they were alive, watching me. I stood, the paper still clutched in my hand, my breath shallow. But when I turned to leave, something in the reflection of the window caught my eye, a figure standing just behind me, still and silent. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs, but there was nothing there. No one. The room was empty. The cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. But the paper, it was still in my hand. The words were the same, but now, they felt like they were mocking me, daring me to understand them. As I stared at the empty space behind me, the truth began to sink in, this wasn't just a warning. It was a clue. A clue to something I had yet to see. Something I wasn't supposed to see. Not yet. But I was getting closer, closer to the edge of whatever this was. And when I finally stepped over it, I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to return. Story 5. I was in the middle of my usual routine, the hum of the day around me when my phone buzzed softly on the table. I glanced at it, expecting a message from a friend or maybe a work update, something mundane to keep the day moving. But when I saw the notification, my stomach sank. The message was from an unknown number, and all it said was, "I'm coming for you." The words hit me like a cold slap to the face. My heart skipped a beat, and a wave of icy terror crawled up my spine. The message was short, direct, and filled with an unsettling urgency that made my skin crawl. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Was it a prank? A random text meant for someone else? I attempted to calm myself, but those words, "I'm coming for you," echoed through my mind like a haunting chant. I checked the number, but it was unlisted, just a string of random digits with no name attached. My pulse quickened, my fingers trembling as I debated whether to ignore it or to reply. Something about the message didn't sit right. It felt wrong, too wrong. It wasn't just some joke or a wrong number. Whoever had sent it, I could feel deep in my gut, wasn't playing games. I sat frozen for a moment, the silence of the apartment pressing in on me. Then, the sensation hit me, the distinct, overwhelming feeling of being watched. My eyes darted around the room, half expecting to see someone standing just outside the window, staring in at me. The stillness seemed too thick, suffocating. I stood up, pacing, trying to shake the dread that had settled in my chest. The message buzzed in my hand again. I had to know more. Who is this? I typed it out quickly, my thumb hovering above the send button. The seconds dragged on, but no reply came. I waited, feeling foolish for even entertaining the idea that someone might respond. Yet, the feeling gnawed at me, like a slow-burning fire of fear that wouldn't let go. And then, just as I was about to set the phone down in frustration, it buzzed once more. This time, the message made my blood run cold. "I know where you are." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a joke anymore. This person knew something, something personal, something intimate. I felt a chill settle in my bones. My breath caught in my throat as my heart began to race uncontrollably. I looked around the apartment again, every creak in the building, every groan of the floorboards, felt like a warning. The shadows seemed deeper now, more sinister. The silence suffocating. My body went rigid. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my phone, checking the number once more. Still, nothing, just a series of untraceable digits. My pulse thudded painfully in my chest, each beat matching the erratic rhythm of my panic. I tried to steady myself, but my mind raced. How had they found me? What were they planning? The tension was unbearable, and then, out of nowhere, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of my front door creaking open. I froze. My heart nearly stopped. Had they somehow gotten inside? I crept toward the door, my hand shaking violently as I reached for the handle. I paused, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no voices. The building was silent. I slowly opened the door, and there, in the hallway, there was no one. Just the empty stretch of dimly lit corridor. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the hallway with growing unease. The place was eerily quiet, yet the feeling of being hunted, of being watched, hung in the air like a thick fog. I rushed back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it, my pulse hammering in my throat. I stood there, motionless, staring at the door, my mind still reeling. What if they were already inside? What if they were right behind me? I picked up the phone again, my hands still shaking. I needed to do something, anything, to get a grip on the situation. I called the police, explaining the strange messages and the growing sense of danger. They reassured me they'd look into it, but without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I thanked them, though I didn't feel comforted. There was no closure in their words, no sense of relief. And then, as if the universe itself wanted to push me deeper into fear, my phone buzzed again. "I'm closer than you think." Panic surged through me, hot and vicious. My stomach lurched. The words felt like a prophecy, and my mind began to spiral. I glanced out the window, my heart pounding. The street below was empty, the only movement was the flickering of the streetlights casting eerie shadows on the pavement. I couldn't stay here. The message wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. I had to leave. But where would I go? How could I escape someone who seemed to know exactly where I was, someone who was always one step ahead? I grabbed my things, my movements frantic. My phone buzzed again, the message chilling me to the bone, "I'm right behind you." I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. Could they have followed me? I spun around, my eyes scanning the dim hallway, but there was nothing, no one. I had to leave, I had no choice. I rushed down the stairs, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. Each step felt heavier, the weight of fear pressing down on me. When I reached the ground floor and stepped out into the night air, the street was empty. I felt momentarily relieved, but the anxiety gnawed at me like a beast in the dark. I checked my phone one last time. Another message. "I'm coming for you." I didn't know what kind of game this person was playing, but it wasn't over. And I had no idea how it was going to end. Story 6. I was cleaning out the attic one afternoon when I stumbled upon an old, weathered journal. Its cover was cracked, the leather brittle and covered in layers of dust. Something about it, some indescribable pull, compelled me to open it. As I lifted the cover, a musty, stale scent of ancient paper flooded my senses, and my fingers lingered over the fragile pages. The handwriting was undeniably mine, but the words, they weren't. At least, they didn't feel like mine. There was a darkness woven through every sentence, a suffocating sense of dread that I didn't recognize. The first entry, dated several years ago, sent a shiver down my spine. "I can hear them in the walls," it read. "They watch me when I sleep. I don't know how long I can keep pretending everything is fine." I couldn't remember writing it, yet I could feel the weight of the words settle in my chest like an invisible hand squeezing my heart. I read it again, then again, until unease crept into every corner of my mind. Had I really been haunted by something so sinister? Had I truly been so terrified in the past? I couldn't recall. The more I flipped through the pages, the more disturbed I became. Each entry grew more unnerving than the last. One spoke of waking up in the dead of night to a cold, clammy hand wrapped tightly around my throat. Another detailed strange symbols that appeared on the walls of my house, symbols I had never seen before. The chill in my bones deepened with every turn of the page. How could I have forgotten these horrors? How could I have written this and then buried it so completely in my mind? But there was more. Faint memories began to resurface, hazy images of shadows lurking in the corners of my room, whispers in the dead of night, but they felt like fragments of a life I didn't recognize. A life I wasn't sure I had lived. The further I read, the more fragmented and desperate the entries became. One said, "It is inside me now." Another, "I can't shake it. I am becoming it." The final page was a twisted scrawl, nearly unreadable, "I won't let it take me. I've hidden it. It will never find me, but it's coming for you now." The words seemed to leap off the page, as though they were alive, pulsating with a warning, or perhaps, a curse. My heart raced as I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. The air in the attic felt thick, heavier now, as if something had shifted. Something old, something patient. Something that had waited for years. I couldn't leave the attic fast enough. The journal, however, remained in my hands. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I couldn't keep it either. It felt like holding a part of myself I wasn't ready to face. Why couldn't I remember writing any of it? What had happened to me? The questions haunted me, swirling in my mind like the dark storm that brewed in the pages of the journal. That night, sleep eluded me completely. Every creak of the house seemed to echo in the silence, every whisper from the walls too familiar, like the ones written in the journal. I lay frozen in bed, the room growing colder, the shadows deepening, as though they had weight, as though they were alive. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable, "It's inside you now." A chill ran through me, the words curling around my spine like ice. I sprang upright, gasping for air, and flicked on the light. The room looked the same, ordinary, untouched by anything supernatural. But the feeling, the suffocating sensation of being watched, it lingered. It pressed on me, like invisible eyes trained on my every move. The following days were a blur. I tried to go about my routine, but the journal kept gnawing at me. Its words, its dread, clawed at my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that I was no longer alone. Every corner I turned, every flicker in my peripheral vision, seemed to reveal something that shouldn't be there, shadows moving where there should be none. I started seeing figures in the corner of my eye, shapes that vanished the moment I looked directly at them. Anxiety consumed me. I had to do something. I decided to burn the journal, to rid myself of whatever evil it contained, to free myself from the presence that seemed to hang over me like a shroud. With trembling hands, I took it outside and set it alight. The flames twisted in strange patterns, dancing wildly in the wind, but even as the journal burned, I felt no relief. In fact, for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something in the flames, something wrong. A figure, half-formed, reaching out toward me, its shape barely visible in the fire. My heart thundered in my chest as I stumbled backward. When the fire died down, the journal was reduced to ash, but the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. I couldn't escape it. Strange occurrences became more frequent. Objects in my house shifted when I wasn't looking, things vanished that I swore had been there moments before. It felt as though something invisible was slowly creeping into every part of my life, taking control. The whispers never stopped. The feeling of being watched only intensified, like eyes that never blinked, always there, always following me. I began to question my sanity. Was it all in my head? Or was I truly being haunted by something beyond understanding? Weeks passed, and the sense of dread became unbearable. I could no longer separate the real from the imagined. I had to know, I had to understand. So I went back to the attic, and there, hidden under the floorboards, I found it. Another journal. Identical to the first, but older, the edges frayed and yellowed with age. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was as though the first journal had never left, as if it had returned to claim me. The same handwriting, my handwriting, greeted me on the first page. And there, once more, was the entry, I can hear them in the walls. The truth hit me like a slap to the face. I had never escaped. The terror had never left. It had always been here, waiting, lurking in the dark corners of my life. And now, it was too late to turn back. Story 7. I had just returned home after an exhausting day, my mind still buzzing with the endless tasks I hadn't yet finished. My body felt drained, desperate for rest, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening alone. The apartment was eerily silent, the kind of silence that wraps itself around you, making everything feel still and almost suffocating. I dropped my bag by the door, the soft thud of it landing on the floor breaking the stillness, but then something caught my eye. Tucked neatly into the frame of the front door was a small, folded piece of paper. My curiosity piqued, I bent down to pick it up. I hadn't seen anyone around, and there were no deliveries or packages, so the note's sudden appearance seemed strange, even unsettling. As I unfolded it, my fingers trembled slightly, and I could feel a chill creep up my spine. The words were written in block letters, neat but blunt. Don't go to the basement. I stood frozen, staring at the note, my mind whirling. Who had left it? Why such a cryptic, ominous message? I didn't even know anyone who would be familiar with my apartment, let alone leave me a warning like this. The thought that someone had been watching me, or had some kind of connection to my apartment, made my skin crawl. I tried to push the thought away, but the message nagged at me, settling into the back of my mind. The basement, it had always unsettled me. I hadn't been down there in months. I had seen it once when I first moved in, a dimly lit, damp space that gave off an air of neglect. It felt cold, as though it had secrets, secrets that should be left undisturbed. And yet, the note lingered, like an invisible hand pressing on my chest. I told myself it was ridiculous to be scared by a simple note. But then, of course, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the note was the kind of thing that could drive anyone to act against their better judgment. I had to know who had left it, why they had written it, and why they were trying to keep me away from that basement. Against all logic and reasoning, I found myself walking toward the stairs that led down. My hand hovered near the railing as I descended, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew heavier as I went lower, thick and musty, as if the very walls of the building were absorbing something dark. The basement felt alive, as though something unseen was watching, waiting. When I reached the bottom, I paused, scanning the room. It was dim, with only a single bulb hanging from the ceiling casting weak light across the cluttered space. Dusty old boxes, forgotten furniture, and cobwebbed shelves filled the room, but my eyes were drawn to the far corner, where an old wooden door stood slightly ajar. It was as if someone had recently been through it. With cautious steps, I moved toward the door. My heart hammered in my chest, the rhythm of it thudding in my ears. Every instinct screamed for me to turn around, to leave, but the words of the note echoed in my mind, growing louder with every step, "Don't go to the basement." What was I doing? What was waiting for me down here? I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound sending a shiver of dread through me. Beyond the door was pure blackness, an oppressive darkness that seemed to stretch out endlessly. There was something in the corner of my vision, something faint, moving, like a shadow shifting just out of reach. I took another step forward, my breath shallow, and as I did, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged as I spun around, only to find the door locked, the handle unyielding. I was trapped. My fingers fumbled for my phone, and when the flashlight flickered to life, the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The room wasn't empty. There were figures standing in the corners, their faces hidden in the shadows. I couldn't tell how many there were, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, hungry eyes. As my light flickered, their forms became clearer. They were tall, impossibly thin, their bodies unnaturally elongated. Their limbs twisted and contorted in ways that defied reason. And their eyes, those glowing eyes. They reflected the light, a predatory gleam that sent a ripple of dread through my veins. I backed up against the wall, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My feet were frozen to the floor. The figures started to move, their steps silent on the cold concrete floor, drawing closer and closer. I could feel their presence, suffocating, pressing in on me. Then, just as I thought I might lose my mind, the sound of the door creaking open behind me snapped me back to reality. The figures froze, their attention shifting toward the door. Without thinking, I darted toward the opening, desperation giving me strength. I ran up the stairs, not daring to look back. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the top, slamming the door behind me and locking it with trembling hands. I leaned against it, my breath ragged, my body shaking with a terror I couldn't explain. The next morning, I forced myself to check the basement door. It was locked, as it should be. There was no sign of the figures, no trace of what had happened. The note was gone, leaving nothing but the echo of its chilling warning. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen in that basement was still out there, waiting. Waiting for me to make the wrong move. I've stayed away from the basement since that night. I haven't received any more notes, and I've never felt the urge to check again. But I know what I felt that night. And I know that some doors are meant to stay closed. Story 8. It was a quiet afternoon, just past noon, and I was at home alone. The house felt unusually still, the kind of silence that almost felt too heavy, too wrong. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through social media, trying to pass the time, but there was something off. A nagging feeling I couldn't quite shake. It was like the air itself was thick with something I couldn't place, something that didn't belong. At first, I heard it faintly, like a breeze passing through the walls. I stopped, listening intently. But it wasn't the wind. No, this was different. It was whispers. Soft, unintelligible voices coming from somewhere deep within the house. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I was alone. The house was empty. There was no reason for anyone to be whispering. No one was supposed to be here. I stood up slowly, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the house settling, the pipes groaning, or maybe it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But the whispers persisted. They weren't loud, but they were unmistakable, growing just a bit clearer with every passing second. I started walking toward the hallway, my feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became, though I still couldn't make out the words. I pushed open the door to the room where the sound seemed to be coming from. The room was empty, just as I expected. Bare walls, an old bed, a few dusty boxes stacked in the corner. Yet, the whispers didn't stop. They filled the air around me, as if the very walls themselves were speaking to me. I stepped further into the room, my pulse racing, and then I heard something distinct. A name. A word. I couldn't tell if it was mine or someone else's, but it sounded too close. My breath hitched, and I spun around, half expecting someone to be standing right behind me. There was nothing. I rushed out of the room, back into the hallway, my mind a tangled mess of confusion and fear. But the whispers followed me, not louder, but closer, much closer. It was as though they were right behind me, breathing down my neck. I turned around frantically, but again, nothing. My phone was still clutched tightly in my hand. Without thinking, I dialed my best friend's number, needing to hear a familiar voice, anything to anchor me back to reality. The phone rang and rang, then went to voicemail. I left a rushed message, telling her about the strange whispers, and hung up. The silence that followed felt even heavier, more oppressive, as if the house itself was closing in around me. I tried to shake it off. Told myself it was nothing. But then, the whispers came again. This time, they were clearer, louder. It wasn't just one voice now, but many. It sounded like a group of people whispering, just out of earshot, urging me to listen, but I couldn't understand any of it. I ran down the stairs, my eyes darting around, trying to find something that would explain all of this. The whispers followed me, reverberating off the walls, echoing in my ears, until it felt like the house itself was filled with voices. I couldn't escape them. I grabbed my jacket and rushed outside, desperate to breathe fresh air, desperate to escape the suffocating feeling inside. But even outside, the feeling didn't go away. I could still hear the whispers in my head, echoing in the quiet moments. My heart was racing, my mind desperately trying to make sense of it all. I paced back and forth in the yard, unsure of what to do, when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the house. I froze. I turned around, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run as far away as possible, but my feet felt like they were cemented to the ground. The footsteps continued, and then the whispers started again. This time, they were more frantic, more urgent. They weren't just words anymore, they were commands. Demanding my attention, urging me to do something, but I couldn't understand what. Without thinking, I turned and ran back inside, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. The house felt different now, like the walls were closing in on me. The whispers were louder, more insistent, and the footsteps had stopped. Instead, there was a low humming sound, as though something, someone, was moving just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I stumbled back into the living room, my eyes scanning every corner. That's when I saw it. A shadow, moving across the wall. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but no. This shadow was solid. Defined. Real. Something was standing in the room with me, and I couldn't see it. I froze, heart hammering in my chest, unable to move, unable to think. The shadow moved closer, and I knew, deep down, that there was no way I was getting out of here without confronting whatever it was. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices all speaking at once, drowning out everything else. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I couldn't breathe. The shadow loomed closer still, now standing right in front of me, but I still couldn't see it. My mind was spiraling, unable to process what was happening. Then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the whispers stopped. The shadow vanished. The house was completely silent again. The air felt cold, and the oppressive weight on my chest lifted. But the silence was wrong. It was too quiet. The feeling of being watched still lingered, like a presence that wouldn't let go. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I bolted out of the house, slamming the door behind me, and didn't stop running until I was far enough away to feel safe. But even now, when I'm alone, the whispers still linger in the back of my mind, echoing in the quiet moments when I least expect them. I don't know what happened that day, and I don't want to know. But I know one thing for sure, I never, ever, went back inside that house again. Story 9. The delivery arrived unexpectedly, its origins shrouded in mystery. No return address, no hint of who could have sent it, just a plain brown package resting on my doorstep. It was odd, too odd to be anything good. I had never ordered anything, and my heart skipped a beat as I looked down at the package, a chill creeping over me. The wrapping was nondescript, the kind you find at any shipping store, but the weight of it felt wrong, heavier than it should have been. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at it, my mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. Who would send me something like this? But no answer came to mind. I reached down and picked it up, the strange sensation of unease deepening as I carried it inside. The silence of the house seemed to press in on me, every creak of the floorboards too loud, too invasive. I set the package on the kitchen table and stared at it. My hands trembled slightly as I carefully began to unwrap it, my pulse quickening. When the brown paper finally fell away, I saw it. An old, broken mirror. The glass was cracked, jagged lines spiderwebbing across its surface, distorting my reflection in a grotesque way. The frame was tarnished, an intricate design that seemed to belong to a time long past. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world at all. The moment my fingers brushed against the mirror, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a primal warning thrumming beneath my skin. I turned the mirror over, half expecting to find a note, some kind of explanation. But there was nothing. Just the broken glass, reflecting my confused face. I set it aside, telling myself it was just a mistake, maybe it was delivered to the wrong address. But despite my rational thoughts, something about the mirror kept pulling me back. I couldn't stop glancing at it, even though I didn't want to. The crack in the glass seemed to shift and change, as if it were alive, watching me. Later that evening, as I tried to forget about the mirror, I was sitting in the living room, but I kept hearing strange noises coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, a faint rustling sound, like something moving, or maybe, breathing. My heart raced as I stood up, the air thick with tension. I walked cautiously toward the kitchen, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. And there it was. The mirror, now leaning against the wall where I had left it. But something was wrong. It wasn't facing the wall anymore. It was facing me. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer. The reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. Instead, there was something standing just out of sight, behind me. My body froze. I whipped around, panic rising in my chest, but the room was empty. I spun back to the mirror, and my stomach dropped. The figure in the reflection was still there, lurking just beyond my reach, its presence heavy in the air. The cold in the room deepened, and the shadows seemed to stretch, creeping along the floor like they were alive. I took a step back, my pulse racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The figure moved, taking a step closer, its form becoming clearer, but still, its face remained hidden in the dark. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to run, but my feet felt heavy, as though something invisible was holding me in place. I felt a sharp tug in my chest, a magnetic pull toward the mirror, like it was calling me. I shook my head, trying to break free, but with every step I took away from it, the figure in the reflection followed, mimicking my every move. Then, I heard it, the whispers. Low and distorted, like voices from another world. They filled the air, pressing in on me from all sides, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. My head spun. The sound was maddening, suffocating. I couldn't take it anymore. In a panic, I grabbed the mirror, my hand shaking violently, and shoved it into a cabinet, slamming the door shut with all my strength. The moment the door closed, the whispers stopped. The suffocating feeling lifted, but I was still shaken to the core, my nerves frayed. I sat in the living room, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe the reflection had played tricks on me, or maybe it was just some weird optical illusion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind rattling the windows, made me jump. I kept thinking I heard someone breathing, slow and deliberate, just outside my door. Footsteps pacing in the hallway. But when I opened the door, no one was there. I wanted to throw the mirror away, to rid myself of it once and for all, but I couldn't. I couldn't face it again. The next day, I went to check on it, but it was gone. The cabinet was empty. I searched the house, opening every drawer, every cupboard, every closet. It was nowhere to be found. A sense of dread settled over me, the feeling that something was wrong, that something was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was still here, hiding just out of sight, waiting for me to find it. That night, I woke to find it again. It was sitting at the foot of my bed, its reflection staring back at me, its eyes not my own. The figure was clearer now, its face twisted into a grotesque grin, the shadows stretching longer than they should have been. I could hear its breath, slow, deliberate, as if it were waiting for something. And then, it moved. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the silence of the room. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, its hand reaching out, as if it were going to touch me. I reached out too, my body moving against my will, drawn toward the mirror like a magnet. The air grew colder. The whispers returned, louder this time, frantic. The figure's hand pressed against the glass, just inches from mine. With a desperate surge of strength, I yanked my hand back and ran, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air biting into my skin. I didn't know where to go, what to do. All I knew was that I couldn't go back into that house, not with the mirror waiting for me. I never found out where it came from, or why it was sent to me. But I knew one thing for sure, the mirror wasn't done with me. It was still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to come back. And one day, I knew, it would find me again. Story 10. I woke up to the soft hum of the early morning, the air still and quiet as it often is in those first moments of the day. The sunlight barely peeked through the curtains, casting a dim glow over the furniture in the room. I reached for my phone, half expecting to glance at the time before getting up, but it wasn't where I had left it. My heart sank a little. The phone was gone. I was sure I had placed it on the nightstand just before I fell asleep. Sitting up, I scanned the room in confusion. My phone had to be somewhere nearby, I must have knocked it off the nightstand in my sleep, right? But no. Nothing. Not a trace of it anywhere. I got out of bed, my mind racing, my thoughts a jumble of confusion. I checked the floor, the bed, every corner where it might have fallen, but still, nothing. The room, though still, felt heavier somehow, as though the air itself had changed overnight. Something felt off. I hesitated, then walked out of the room, casting a quick glance down the hallway. What was I even looking for? A sense of unease crept over me, a strange pull that urged me toward the living room, though I couldn't explain why. My pulse quickened as I stepped into the hallway, and there it was, the phone. There, lying innocently on the couch, the screen dimly lit, as though it had been waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat. How had it gotten there? I hadn't moved from the bed, I was certain of it. I hadn't walked into the living room. I hadn't touched the phone. Questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers. Only the phone, sitting on the couch like some eerie invitation. I walked toward it, my body tense, my hands trembling as I reached for it. The second my fingers brushed the screen, I noticed something strange. The last app one had been on before falling asleep, it wasn't there anymore. The phone had switched to a completely different app. A black screen with a faint blinking cursor. It was like the phone was waiting for something, but for what? I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to make sense of it all. The more I looked, the more uneasy I became. The cursor blinked faster, as though it was urging me to do something, but what? I swiped the screen, trying to get back to my normal apps, but the phone wouldn't respond. It was like it had become unresponsive, trapped in this strange state. A chill ran down my spine. Was someone in the house? I hadn't heard anything, and the door was locked. I tried to shake off the thought, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence in the room was suffocating, and it felt like I was being watched, as if eyes were upon me from somewhere in the shadows. I glanced around the room. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of the silence pressing in from all sides. Turning back to the phone, I wiped the screen again, this time with more urgency. But the blinking cursor wouldn't go away. It mocked me, as though it knew something I didn't. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands slick with sweat. I couldn't bring myself to turn off the phone. I didn't want to break the eerie silence that had overtaken the room. Then, suddenly, the phone flickered. The screen flashed bright for a moment, blinding me, and then, in an instant, it returned to normal. My apps were back. Exactly as they had been before I fell asleep. But that strange black screen, the one with the cursor, it was gone. I felt a brief wave of relief, but it was short-lived. I glanced at the clock. The time was wrong. It wasn't right. It was hours later than I remember. I had only gone to sleep an hour ago, or so I thought. But now, the clock on the phone read nearly midday. Confusion turned to dread. Had I lost time? Had something happened while I was asleep that I couldn't remember? I hurriedly checked the other rooms, half expecting to find something, anything, someone waiting for me. But no. The house was quiet, everything in its place. Nothing disturbed. No sign that anyone had been there. But the unease didn't leave me. It clung to me, tightening around my chest. I sat down on the couch, my phone still in my hand, trying to rationalize it all. Maybe I was just tired, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong. Something was off. I opened a few apps to distract myself, to give my racing thoughts somewhere to go. But even as I scrolled through them, I couldn't shake the feeling that the phone wasn't the same. It felt different. Like it had been used without my knowledge. Suddenly, I stood up abruptly, my mind racing, my body almost vibrating with anxiety. I walked to the kitchen, hoping to calm myself, but the unease lingered. Every shadow seemed darker. Every sound seemed louder. It was as if the house itself was holding secrets, secrets I wasn't meant to know. I returned to the living room and set the phone down on the table, hoping to shake the feeling. But then, my reflection in the window caught my eye. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the reflection, I saw myself, standing still, staring at the phone. But behind me, just beyond the window, was a figure. It was blurry, like a shadow, but I could make out the shape of a person standing there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I turned around quickly. There was no one there. The figure in the reflection had vanished. But the feeling of being watched, it didn't go away. It only grew stronger. I grabbed my phone again, my hands shaking as I unlocked it. The screen flickered for a second. Then, something strange happened. A new message appeared on the screen from an unknown number. The message was short, but the words sent a chill through me. "I've been waiting for you.